Hello everyone, today in view of other videos on the Italian Seigneuries incoming, we're going to discuss a bit like the prodrome of this phenomenon and or some specific dynamics, especially in the early phase. You know that I've made lots of videos about the Italian Communes and objectively not so many about the Italian Seigneuries or lordships, if you prefer. Today we will examine in part also the terminological aspect of the story, but we in fact need to cover this for many reasons we will be affirming now concerning the reasons of this institutional and political development of regimes like the communal ones that had substantially a republican profile, even though that in part would actually be maintained, but that had not gone, at least so straightforwardly, like from the second half to the first half of the 14th century towards such an openly oligarchic and aristocratic direction. Actually, I've made many videos about the foundation of the Italian communes that I think, first of all, it's not a very discussed topic. There is just a generic sort of, these things kind of existed. If you search around YouTube, basically I'm the only person who's covering the topic in the actual, historical depth that it deserves. Part of the reason why they are neglected as a topic, I already explained as well. It's fundamentally a difficult chapter. You need to know the exact political and social evolution within the communes. It is not just like the simplistic, like from democratic to sort of autocratic system. That it's wrong. Conceptually, it's actually went through different stages, and it was already founded at the beginning, essentially by the military elite, right? And so an aristocracy that was clanic in nature, invested in many activities, not just war, but also law, agriculture, commerce, right? So it's difficult even just to profile the groups that had been at the root of the consular regime, and in a time in which the politics and society of the communes was sort of simpler, right? When we look at the 13th and 14th century, we look at the acme of the communes that have taken on, starting essentially from the mid-13th century, as a truly statal profile. We often call them like city-states, but in a strictly institutional and broadly political sense, they became states only, and we will see this today only in this phase, right? With a more concentrated power, a much clearer sense of the central public civil authority that in fact also corresponds with the peak of, in many ways, of medieval civilization, at least in a civil sense. You see that, of course, there are feudal monarchies that reach their peak as, in fact, true states in their own regard, but they have also a very different mechanism from the one of the Italian city-states, so that there are sort of a parallel between one another. We will have to make more comparison between the two, also considering that they really compenetrated a bit each other. Also, the 14th century is the affirmation of the so-called regional states in Italy, so something actually that went beyond the mere city-state and affirmed itself as in fact, a regionally sized territorial state that, similarly to the national monarchies, actually paved the way to what we'll see now, effectively a pre-modern power, right? You can argue that, especially in these centers, all the ideas that we sort of associate with modernity, with republicanism, were forged within the Italian patriciate during humanism, the Renaissance. I mean, Tolkien, Machiavelli, or the broader think about Florentine political thought, are definitely a major breakthrough in the way Europe has conceived its own statal identity. I mean, in many ways, there is a connection from like the Hellenic city-states passing through the Italian seigneuries, but also much more what had existed before. And that's why, in fact, the passage from the 13th to the 14th century is so crucial, because actually this is not just one of the single most underrated chapters in Western history, but probably a foundational one, just in function of humanism or Renaissance, but literally of much of statehood that had already affirmed itself at this point, right? This is, I think, the macroscopic reality has been possibly missed the most in relative terms by the medieval historiography so far. I mean, if you study the topics like the Italians have studied this so much, like in Western Europe, generally speaking, the Italian communes are a massive historiographical topic. That's what surprises me also about YouTube, that this, say, what actual academic knowledge and culture does not filter pop culture. That's it's something that calls me a bit also into, like, speaking of conscience and backstage feelings, like, and impressions, like, quite into question, because I have studied abundantly all these topics and beyond, and when I pick them for Schwerpunkt, I always insist on the, let's say, the necessity of presenting history not for what people want, say, like, think that they would like to hear, but what they in fact do not know, and based on a rigidly hierarchical difference in the objective importance of these historical topics. Like, history is not an opinion, it's not a supermarket when you can't pick just, like, whatever makes you feel like, for whatever identitaristic or aestheticistic reasons, in a decadent, tolerant, society. And, I don't see any culture, telling you the truth, in today's times. But what actually reality in a macroscopic sense has been. Like, I think all the videos on the Italian communes that I provided you with by this point made it abundantly clear. This was a massive system. 1/4 of the European population was concentrated in Italy. The central and northern Italian city-states were in fact at the center of this incredible political and institutional development, and this is the thing that is also missed the most. Like, they were characterized by a striking level of homogeneity, right? Unfortunately, also in the academia, there is this sense of, like, deconstructionistically trying to find the differences, but without having found the macroscopic homogeneity of these phenomena. And whenever you search for these topics on the internet, I don't know, for example, Kings and Generals made some months ago a video called, like, Is Italian Disunity or something like that, but it doesn't even start delving into the actual essence and concreteness of these city-states development. And so it always passes as if, like, just looking, because we are influenced, whether we like it or not, a 19th century sort of Victorian type of, political mapping visualization. Like, if we see something small, we think automatically, well, this is less important, right? If you see a huge blob that maybe it doesn't even correspond to something more politically unitary, we immediately say, oh, this is sort of more important. For the maps of the Middle Ages, this has been a huge problem. Like, if you look at the maps that can circulate, the ones I show you sometimes as well, for example, the Holy Roman Empire, for the sake of simplicity, is shown like a huge thing, like encompassing, most of Central Europe and central northern Italy, and it's basically only one color, right? And automatically it sort of shifts your attention away from it, because essentially the people who drew that were too lazy to describe what was actually within that and how it was evolving. And even if you were to see that some of the most detailed maps representing, for example, the central northern Italy, you often see, well, but there are all these city-states, I don't even know, like, what they are, like, I've never heard of the history of the individual city, whatever. And so I actually presume that it doesn't matter. These were kind of like mercantile republics, right? So they were basically just about that. Nobody has actually told you what the systems concretely were, what kind of politics or military history was behind that. And the simple reason is that in many ways, this, especially after World War II, has been neglected for structuralistic, Marxistic reasons. Say, let's look at socio-economical stuff and let's skip entirely politics in a again, structuralistic, formalistic, juridicistic sense. Like, for example, let's pretend that, I don't know, communal history is about how they changed titles at the top or in the communes in the documents, and not and skipping entirely like all the political strength ratios and pretty heavy and military, in fact, molding in this phase, like even like generic observers like Contamine, for example, pointed out that Italy had the highest level of belligerence of the entire Europe at this point. And if you look at the resources that the Italians consumed in warfare, both on land and at sea, that's something utterly insane. Like the output of this system was actually larger than the one of the Kingdom of France entirely. And when you picture that, you all of a sudden realize, wait a minute, but so this is a massive chapter in the medieval history, maybe that in Western identity that nobody has even remotely showed you. Why is that? Right, good question. It's always like difficult again to present it to you, but people focus on the latter phase, like in the let's say if starting from the mid 14th century, everybody has heard of, I don't know, of course the soldiers of fortune, like the time of the White Company, of John Hawkwood, the Battle of Castagnaro, the various seigneuries, the splendor of the Italian courts during the Renaissance. But what about this phase, this 100 years from, say, 1250 to 1350, that were by far much bigger in scale? Like also actually what was happening in Europe, for example, I think the 13th century overall is dramatically underrated when you realize even in pop culture what like the various parts of European, say the various regions of Europe, what they were actually up to, and like how they're represented culturally. Zero, right? It's utterly insane. There is a severe cultural problem, right? Just in the world. This should be the West's task to revise that, because of course the rest of the world doesn't even know what history is. Here we somehow still remember that there was something called history, but we still focus on the same old I love English history, English warfare during the period, but it's always like that. Like if you see either the Scottish Wars of Independence or some aspect of whatever it's connected with the Wars of the Roses or the 100 Years War from an English perspective, the rest is like, okay, well, yeah, there were these other guys, but who cares, right? So this is in many ways insane, but one of the first reasons why I actually covered these topics and I give them such big space, because I want to stress the shocking disproportionality in the importance that these places and times objectively had, and the pop cultural representance that is attributed to them. So today, well, I have actually, and this always happens with the cycle, there are some topics that repeat themselves closely, like in interest of time. I have something about the Italian seigneuries of the late 13th century, which was also which normally you think about the 1400s, right? They started from the mid 13th century, coexisting with the communes. That's also, I think, a topic that I give for granted for somebody who's interested in medieval history. There's no such a thing like, the seigneuries rise and the communes disappear. Actually, this thing go on, and it's just these different, let's say, institutional outcomes that are interesting to observe, because not all the Italian lordships were the same. Not all the cities on which they were founded, even as regional states, so at the end of the day taking over other communes, were run in the same way. They had the same balance. The other day I made a video, for example, about medieval Milan from the 13th to the 15th century, to the 16th century actually. And we have observed how notoriously Milan was a more autocratic, if you want, as they called themselves, but with a very different meaning from the one we do, a tyrannic regime that is mostly also adverse by instead the Florentine republicanism that de facto was a sort of monarchy under the Medici, telling the truth. But that had different institutional forms, all right? This is relevant in as much as also certain communes, as we were just saying, like rise to these, like Milan, Florence began to rule over other cities. This is the difference also with basically the other European communes, that the Italians basically created states on the basis of cities, right? Ruling over other cities. In the rest of Europe at large, the feudal monarchies said halt, like they did center at some point, especially towards the second half of the 15th century, their incipient modern, say, national states on important urban centers, but that were importantly depleted from an important level of local autonomy, right? This actually happens also within Italy, because again, when Milan or Venice or Florence take over, and it's not just about them, I mean, there are minor actors that, however, are still quite relevant. Other cities, we'll see it today, they sort of curbed their own autonomies, they subjected them, and so this did take on a truly statal profile that is the obvious tendency of a civilizational development. The communes under, like, even if you look at these subject communes in central northern Italy, they would historically maintain an important autonomy. You can actually argue that if you look at the GDP map of Europe today, the consequence of the much greater, for example, northern central Italian development from the south derives from the fact that even, say, what may appear as the most obscurantistic and backwards papal states of, say, the 19th century, the communes of Lazio, Umbria, and the Marches were more productive than the towns of southern Italy, simply because since Norman times, the south had been feudalized, the autonomy of the southern Italian cities that had actually taken off earlier, as especially maritime centers, than the northern ones were choked, in fact, by a true feudal state. This happened fundamentally in the other European countries. I mean, if you look at France today, you realize, again, by power, wealth concentration, that it's just Paris. Like, yes, there is Lyon and Marseille that in fact are in the south, are in areas that sort of France, as the northern French power, arrived later, but it's not that France had, of course, there were differences in the levels of urbanization in Europe since Roman times, but most of what we see today in that case is the incredibly powerful concentration capacity of the French monarchy from the Ile-de-France and Paris to, in fact, derive like power from the subjection of this surrounding to an impressive scale. And this is true largely for Spain, even for England. I mean, before the Industrial Revolution, basically England is just London. I mean, there is not much debate about it. And still is today, but by some proportion. Like, even if other cities are very, very important, great industrial centers, but still the heart of England developed from the capital. That was also a much older capital than Paris, functionally speaking, since the Middle Ages. This is also true in part for Germany, that didn't really have strong states until the 16th century. At least, even there was a great difficulty in centralizing. It's fair to say that until the 18th century wasn't like that full regionally territorialized, concentrated level of power. It was much, let's say, Central Europe was much more of a feudal country still. The Italians, in this sense, during the Renaissance, had their own neatly outlined states, either under Spanish occupation or basically in autonomy, like, I don't know, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, Tuscany. that maintained that level of civil development. And this does stem from these times, and also much earlier, if you want. As you know, I'm a great proponent of the actual continuity in urban, municipal, cultural, and identity from Roman times throughout, even the present, if you want, especially in Italy. And that is truly the only country in Europe that had that without discontinuity. You see, at a certain point during the Middle Ages, at the beginning of that, there had been a unhinging of that sort of civil, urban, statal physiognomy, right? Cities never in Western Europe were very well rooted properly in the hinterland, differently from the Greek influenced world. So countries like Spain, Italy, France, Britain had maintained, even Britain, right, in many ways, even though their urbanism went down consistently. Great part of what you see in Western development today, even Western, Germany, Southern Germany, the Benelux, it does stem from that. It does stem heavily from a Roman border, Roman boundary, if you want. But you see, the Italian never had that sort of failed state discontinuity for which some lord of feudal hierarchy took over and privatized everything and choked the city as a system. The city always maintained, was the hardcore cornerstone around which basically everything that happened in the country revolved around, right? And couldn't be separated in the first place, right? So as we've seen many times in other videos about Italian communes, this is in fact where these guys come from. Italy had was a feudal monarchy, from Carolingian times. I mean, the Longobards already had, of course, established the monarchy, but it was not much of a feudal system. In fact, the cities worked much better governmentally than basically anywhere else. And simply the thing continued over time. These centers boomed, especially from you can say the 10th century, the 11th, the communes take off from the end of the 11th century, and they basically substitute themselves to the feudal authority. The feudal element still remains in Italy. That also a very interesting, yet secondary aspect of power balance in the peninsula. I've tried my best to explain this, especially in the videos about the Germanic rule. The various Germanic reigns, as intermittent, as just meteoric as they were, because of course these rulers would always come back to Germany after the expedition. But, and at least especially in the communes, there was never a permanence in that. You may have the Swabians that take over dynastically and feudally the Sicilian kingdom, but fundamentally these city-states always ruled themselves by themselves, right? Even when they recognized the king, the emperor, and they had it coming there, and they worked together with it because it was the unavoidable public and universal authority that, of course, in a traditional world, nobody would even remotely think to reject. The wars, for example, between the Lombard League and the Hohenstaufen have absolutely nothing to do conceptually with that. None of those guys fighting against Imperials already thought that this fight was over the existence of the Imperial authority. It was about the fairness of the Imperial authority, which was a completely different thing. It was about the office. And I think this division, especially as far as the investiture controversy goes, is at the foundation of some of the most radically advanced and incredible accomplishments of Western civilization. The double thread awareness of this, not a Byzantine sclerotization of an autocratic power that had to emulate God but failed and did not have any internal counter, for which it basically collapsed. In fact, it was saying Western civilization. There is a despicably self-sabotaging Western identity, sort of attempt in reevaluating, for example, the Orthodox world as if it ever accomplished anything in comparison to the West. After the clamorous failure at any level of the Byzantine or the Eastern European world, by, again, macroscopical scale and no appeal whatsoever, till this very day. I mean, these were the countries that were even taken over directly by communism, and there is a specific reason, right, why that it happened in those countries in the West that was not affected by that. And there is at least it did not go the same picture, the same regime, and this is stemming, in my opinion, from, of course, not just like the obvious confusion that people like today, backwards equates traditional, which has absolutely no value whatsoever. Tradition highlights power is divine grace, weakness is cultural inferiority due to individual shortcoming, due to evil and ignorance, which is exactly the same reason why I presume that these mistakes are existing, exactly because people have literally never heard of the vital importance of these chapters in Western history. They essentially do not understand what Western history is. I mean, being born or brought up in the West today, specifically, like, of course, makes you closer to being a Westerner than anything, but it's not an actual, an actually satisfactory datum to make you a Westerner. Like, a kid born and raised today will not even know, like, the basic meaning of, say, the Catholic tradition, both in pagan and Christian times, does not properly have an idea of why we celebrate the empire, the role of Rome, the actual role of Rome in this, why, like, also what the Holy Roman Empire actually was, and also in relation to the Byzantine. There's this other thing again of legalistic saying, no, that was just the Byzantine Empire to continue Romanity. The rest is a false one. On which actual basis? It would be very interesting theologically, just in the history of religion, or even just asking a 4th century BC Roman, looking at what had been happening in Latin Germanic Europe compared to the Byzantine one, what actually the empire and its Romanity were about. Of course, this stems from the Black Legion, anti-Catholicism, the sense of, again, that there is a general degeneration. Also, the Italian seigneuries are often intended in this sort of decadentistic way because of the also 18, like especially 19th century, in fact, rejection of universal imperial values and sort of the shrinking of the fourth estate to the national basis and nothing else. So it's not to say that the national basis has not a function in ecumenic domination. It's just that literally with the 19th century mass society, they stopped exclusively to that. So they basically severed the capacity to elevate the same nations to any degree of imperial superiority. So it's all very complicated because everything has a double thread, but that's what in fact escapes even just dichotomically the fundamental reasoning of most of the masses today, that everything is either black or white, but the way it manifests in reality, in its compenetration, is completely skipped, because that's actually where you can distinguish black from white, but only you go through like this incredibly complex critique of the analysis, and not because you actually have the tools to understand that without a massive historical background, which of course is non-existent, just parentally or educationally, scholastically speaking. It's just people are not raised like this anymore. So that it's just at some point it was also a matter of spiritual predisposition. This is literally about not having the cognitive tools anymore to understand these things or the references to them anymore. But let's go back to the question of the personal seigneuries, because at the end of the day, that's what starts happening in the Italian communes. I have already, again, made videos explaining this, like the first lords, William VII of Montferrat, Albert Pallavicino, Ezzelino da Romano. We will talk about the latter, especially in an incoming video. And I already discussed in telemetry. These guys had risen to power essentially as, again, in the function of captains of certain, like, other communal officials, and cumulating these offices in multiple cities at a time, which was a very convenient way actually for the same communes to be under the temporary and partial protection of a strongman like these essential noblemen, because again these people came even from the feudal nobility, importantly severed from the direct appointment, imperial appointment. If anything, these were co-opted eventually just by the imperial authority, or others, for example the Angevins, especially after 1266, to rule in fact over multiple cities at a time. It's a bit like what happens in other countries in Europe, where you have a guy that becomes the king of, I don't know, 4 kingdoms at some point at a time, and he actually rules only from one, but he manages to get a tiny bit from each of them, so that the local oligarchies do not have to pay too much. They actually privatize the system, and their state actually fails in that case. And the guy can use the surplus to centralize from another place. Here it works in as much as some communes do start essentially entrusting their own defense, their own government to these strongmen that, in fact, do not have per se much of a role in disintegrating the independence of these communes. This, especially in the mid 13th century, we are far from that. But that really waged war to an unprecedented degree, unprecedented scale, especially after the death of Frederick II. You really have this late communal phase opening together with the various seigneuries that had already started actually exactly under Frederick II, that began to appoint these vicars and entrusting them to control different cities at a time. There was, again, not ever a direct control of the cities. Like, we are completely far from that. These communes had all their government, their constitutions. They were incredibly watchful over their own prerogatives. But this constant effort was happening when the Italians began to fight against each other without any control. After the Hohenstaufen had extinguished themselves, and also the Angevins were not so actually oppressive towards central northern Italy. They did have a military presence. They were, I know, Charles of Anjou did become the lord of this or that city, but it was mostly like, you pay me a bit of money and I'll maintain some garrison, right, some tens of horsemen there, and if we have to make war against the neighboring commune, as it always happened, but the thing now was being framed ever more into the Guelph-Ghibelline struggles, taking on a truly international character. Especially from this point onwards, we will keep on fighting. We'll use them. I mean, but in fact, they would go on with the communal resources to fight wars that were aiming at properly destabilizing the enemy communes that at this point were becoming really powerful against city-states. With this war did really produce the measures hostilities necessary to even suspend many liberties, because that's with martial law when essentially what happens. Society is very rich, is actually the richest that has ever existed actually in the world, because again the let's say it's difficult to calculate this, but let's say that early 14th century Florence has reached definitely the life standards of Antonine Rome, right? And it's actually surpassing, like, there is a general distribution of wealth and even a level of, in fact, a locally developed statehood, which is not, in fact, as many people would like to see the Middle Ages as. There was no state, people were so free and had no, like, the ghetto, periphery of Europe, backwards, poor, and whatever was like that. These places instead were obviously, as the most advanced, the richest, the most literate, the more developed, the most statalized ones, and the most also military powerful one at the same time. But of course, every civilization, and we've seen it many times, it does have its ups and downs. While the 13th century is the maximum, in fact, of the great medieval civilization reaching its peak and having this unprecedented level of development. In fact, also, statally speaking, the 14th century is the big contraction that strikes a bit everybody, including these places. which in fact suffer through, like, the oligarchization and privatization of the system is pretty much across all over Europe without any exception the phenomenon that we also call like the true affirmation of the ancien regime, because what people think that, I don't know, the ancien regime was, okay, in the year 1000 was the ancien regime. No, the ancien regime is a late medieval thing. Before that, even the peasantry was arguably poorer or more primitive, but also was more autonomous, and that's what we were just saying, like that there wasn't a better time in which there were less authority and people lived better, right? That this is just fourth estate paranoia / mental illness of any sort that, in fact, the lesser people invented in the last generations, because they were incapable of self-actualization in a disgustingly wealthy and easy world to live in to justify, in fact, their own personal failure. The world has always potently pushed towards the affirmation of power, and our greatest life quality improvement and achievements always pass through this, right? This is not to say that it's easy to maintain it. In fact, yes, spiritually speaking, this tends to extinguish individual responsibility, but it is a matter of individual choice, right? You could keep up with that, and actually would be much easier to do so in a world like this. But again, we are fallen kind, and after all, the world has been prophesied to go towards this direction. Just do not confuse the development of civilization in that sense, because the ultimate point is also actually the destruction of civilization as the fall. What civilization does is trying to keep back things together in divine unity that cannot be achieved without, in fact, universal power, concentration all over the world, and that all these cultures were incredibly aware of, and that's what the entire deal of the empire really was. And of course, the standards of individual capacity, but also of in responsibility of conscience. That's why I was saying before that the controversy, the investiture controversy, being one of the greatest civilizational boosters of all, like this. These cities also being the proof of that, as they develop exactly in the wake of that struggle, is one of the single most important achievements. That, yes, it did lead to the shortcoming of the empire. Again, the empire did decline historically from Roman times to later, so this is not to say that anyone came to that level of power concentration. If anything, today we see a disgregation of power. Whatever it's the disgregation of power is a form of human failure, right, in keeping it together for the good reason, right? Because there's nothing wrong that can't keep itself together. That's the great issue at the end of the day, right? Being defeated is not like we must destroy power because it's power is evil. No, power is supposed to be good. Right, that's the entire deal. And our effort to come back to God, that's exactly our elevation to his same level. People, I don't know, who read Tolkien, etc., just think that in the completely passive sort of 20th century, now giving up and heavily Protestantly influenced, doesn't matter how Catholic, an author like that could claim to be. And so being scared of power because of the incapacity of handling it, because, of course, the personal shortcomings, now becoming like the hallmark. It add a bit of, again, paranoia towards the concept of tyranny, at least the exasperation of tyranny towards anything that actually has nothing to do with that. See, like, I don't know, people supporting Putin's Russia, but complaining about the European Union or the United States, because notoriously just, everything gets down only to the sick mentality of a few disgustingly leftistic elites, as if all our actual power and life quality and values did not exist in parallel, and culturally underdeveloped peoples had anything to do with anything even remotely close as an achievement. But again, that's the world in which we live, and that's why it's important to, I think, reconnect also these historical topics exactly to the meaning that was incredibly clear to them as well. In fact, there are lots of parallelisms as far as the erosion of civil culture in these systems really were. It's again the great collapse of, like, and that's why the 13th to 14th century is very interesting for us at the beginning of the 21st century, because it's a collapse of the people and the lesser people, right? The ancien regime that is formed out of that is a great save by the oligarchies, by the aristocracies that eventually brought Western civilization further to be eventually like also sclerotizing themselves much later on, for which the third estate revolutions took place, opening to the fourth estate, by the way, quite quickly. But that were actually the guys who managed to preserve the medieval civilization. The Renaissance modernity is actually just a continuation of it's actually a medieval civilization in ants. It's not even the modern world never existed. It was medieval all along until 1792 or 1919, depending on where you lean. And it's very similar to this day, because in fact one factor that is often, as I was saying before, not considered in the transition from, let's say, the classical communal era to the age of the seigneuries. Again, the commune existed all along, but then now there was somebody at the head of it in a much more sort of autocratic fashion, and still also an oligarchic one. Again, there was still a republican system, but it was about the social certification of the world that, as we will see now, did save, in fact, much of what had been effectively functioning before. Like between the 13th and the 14th century, these communes became true states. They began to be incredibly efficient, incredibly centralized. They, even from a military point of view, have the highest integration of the various arms in medieval warfare happening in central northern Italy. And you have, in fact, in parallel, an enormous amount of military power spent against these competing rivals that were initially 30 city-states, eventually reduced to like a handful, at least major ones, by the second half of the 14th century. Out of all these wars, what did happen, really? This is what people tend to forget. Like, at some point, a people conquers another, so what happened? The other people is eliminated, or here actually were the same people, as you understand. They spoke the same language, they understood each other very clearly. That's the other mythology that, allegedly before the Italian unification, this system was not one of the single most culturally and linguistically homogeneous out there. Like, people take the extremes, like, I don't know, people from Piedmont and the ones from Sicily. It actually spoke unequivocally Italian. They may have not understood the various local dialects, but generally speaking, Italian as a language of not even the elites, but just the literate, and that in Italy, as we've seen, were much more common than basically any other place, so much more evenly distributed among the population than anywhere else in the globe, was incredibly shared. Like, if you read the chronicles in Italian vernacular of the time, leaving aside the fact that there was a massive knowledge of Latin that was written in a pre-humanistic fashion, there was a massive chronicle and historiographical work output at this time, with an immense amount of data on warfare, like anywhere in Europe, you can see that they were really writing the same language, right? It's incredibly easy to learn, especially if you know modern Italian. You can easily see it. There's not even a debate about this. There's never been historically. So why do I say this? Because when you see such homogeneous backgrounds, this is true even for medieval history in general. Like, it's not that the medieval world differed dramatically, especially if we look at Europe from one another. So what actually differs is sort of easier to spot, right? And as such, when you look at the seigneurialization of the Italian communes, you objectively come to the most self-evident conclusion that somebody gave power to these lords. I mean, it's not that people died en masse. They were literally slaughtered on the battlefield. It did happen on multiple occasions. Actually, when you look at the rise of the seigneuries, you realize that in most Italian cities, this happened after a military defeat of some sort. That's something historiography has skipped completely. We're talking especially the early 14th century, especially the 10s, the 20s, right? By the 30s, the 40s, we're already into this pre-crisis, you see. It's not even the Black Death that causes the change in Europe. Like today, we reason more in terms of like the Black Death spread even just at an immunitary level because the social conditions had worsened before this, and a great part of this had been caused by these enormous human and material expenses through prolonged warfare with insane expense like military output. Again, consider that just a country like the King of France had something like 5,000-6,000 men at arms in its service, which is exactly what Milan, Verona, and Florence had separately. Like it's like this. This is the level that I'm talking about before. This scale of power, actively waged. We've seen this also in the videos about medieval France, because Philippe de Commines is also quite clear in illustrating that the French had gotten the idea of some permanent armies from the great Italian lords, especially the Milanese, that were de facto maintaining already 5,000-6,000 men at arms, just heavy cavalry. At the time, mostly Germans, by the way, because after the crisis of the Ministeriales and the general one of the 14th century, Germany had began to sell out knights like crazy. Just yesterday I was talking about the Battle of Pelagonia, where there is the vanguard of the German elite knights from both sides clashing, opening the engagement. This is very typical. You find them in France, you find them in Scandinavia, whatever. But Italy is the place that pays best, and so you find an enormity of Germans that were also technically responding also to their lords at home. Most of these people came back to Germany, like they didn't settle in Italy, or they were in Felf, whatever. But they were basically used by these Italian lords, and it's very interesting when Ludwig the Bavarian was entering Italy and asking its Ghibelline allies what was whether they needed help or whatever. He said, look, we have more German mercenaries in our service than you, and that shows you also the attitude that these guys kind of had towards the emperor, that they had as a general authority defeated also recently with Henry VII, and so it's really one of those pictures that you wanna look at over and over and over again, because like historiography has not even began to analyze it, to study it adequately, and it's all largely about warfare, by the way. The passage to the Seigneury, however, in a increasingly, let's say, centralized or also in an or oligarchic sense, is to be considered as positive in the general civil development situation. It is true that it was happening in a moment of crisis, right? In a moment of emergency, in a moment of external disturbance as well. So you have to consider these policies again at the war with one another. You have to understand that from the 18th to 19th century, again, the paradigm is that if there is a more autocratic power, tendentially this is negative, especially if things were coming from a apparently democratic, which is a word that actually doesn't make any sense, because there never was the demos strictly meant ever ruling anywhere, especially also these ones, but rather a republican form. Now, this is true, like, depending on how morally active the people is, meaning that you can have an autocratic sclerotic system, like you see, in fact, I don't know, in the Byzantine world or in today's autocratic regimes and from culturally inferior people around the world, because those are broken people. They are weak people. They may have even some a traditional approach somewhere, but in an incredibly backwards, primitive, and weak, unaccomplished level, right? That cannot wield power. If you actually have instead an autocratic level that is able to provide power, and this is not to say autocratic in the sense that it was necessarily destroying, again, for example, the pre-existing establishment. This is not what actually happens in seigneurial Italy as well. It's just greater concentration of power for example, that is literally entrusted by these peoples, especially for military purpose, because without that you can't quite take effective political strategic decisions. The Italian communes, as we've seen, and that's why we're differentiating the statal and pre-statal divide, like that is roughly 1250, had been, in fact, in the previous phase, composed by not a unitary institution. I mean, the commune was a sort of a general alliance of different groups that existed within the urban community, and that were all organized autonomously with their guilds. I made videos recently about this, but generally speaking, there were so many different types of associations, war bands, parishes, quarters, and more. In the moment of heightened, of more intense warfare in these centuries, you obviously need this guy saying, look, we cannot go at war like with all small different groups like trying to negotiate with one another. This had led to actual political paralysis. For example, the advent of the podestas, also a bit before this time, at the beginning of the 13th century, where in fact, the consular regime was, let's say, in crisis, and the people rose, but not the people in the sense of, again, of the demos. These were actually aristocrats themselves, but they were not the expression of the ancient military consular class that had sort of shut down like knighthood had done in basically Europe at the same level, and that now wanted to participate, had brought to like such intense conflict within the city that they said, okay, we need to call somebody else from the outside that is just like actually defending, is obeying us. Like we call him to rule on us, but not in the sense that he has to invent the laws or, you know, using iron fist. We have our own communes, our own councils. We have our own constitutions. Every commune had it relatively different. And we tell him what to do, and especially he has to be a sort of arbiter, a judge, and eventually this figure that was usually called from an external commune. So there were other Italians fundamentally, or strong band like Charles of Anjou we were calling him before, or some, yeah, that's mostly what it is at that point. If you look at the chronology, of course, because the emperors do not really come anymore to rule at that point, do not stay long enough. These figures instead were permanent. The Podestas families were also specializing, like a guy from Perugia could become the Podesta of Brescia, and his son would do the same because they would know exactly the Brescian laws, etc. And over time, of course, the local communes knew what their politics was about, and the Podesta mostly becomes a military commander, right? This is also the phase of the spread of mercenary companies. In general, coming from the 13th century, you know, that we associate mercenarism mostly with, again, the soldiers of fortune, the veterans of the 100 Years' War, in fact, the phase of the greater seigneuries. But actually, throughout the 13th century, you do see the growth of the condotta of the indenture. It's just how professionals would fight, as I was saying before, like that, especially say when looking Italy from the external, especially Anglo-Saxon historiography, made it the drama of the terrible condottieri. It's just like how any mercenary was recruited from centuries everywhere. Like the English indenture is literally the same thing, but you know, it's more dramatic, right? Because it's kind of Italy and this plots and the lords that assassinate each other were struggling. It's something weird, it's something dark, it's something that, you know, especially in the 19th century, made much of, Southern Europe in this decadentistic reality. Let's look at what we're doing because it's kind of fun. And that's more like the temper and the attitude, the emotional background that sort of was filtered in broader pop culture. It's like what you find, again, TV series about the Borgias, but of course, like looking at the 13th and 14th century, people do not even know what the hell was going on at the time, even though it was arguably much more important overall. And this power concentration was actually very functional, very positive. during the end of the 13th century, during the beginning of the 14th. I mean, these communes really reached a level of compaction and effectiveness governmentally, strategically. It was really unprecedented, and that was capable of moving, again, enormous coalitions and fighting with an incredible relentlessness. I mean, the effort of the communities, of the citizenry, of the peasantry was insane. Like we see, because you would think they were already softened up. No, they literally spent themselves, they exhausted themselves, till they began to say, we can't make it anymore, we can't take it anymore. This is something you actually find pretty much all over Europe when you realize that the 14th century crisis approaches. It's always about war, right? Everywhere, in every single country. Communities are exhausted, right? But the only difference that Italy had a major surplus that also these other places did not, could not harness in this, in fact, more locally concentrated fashion. And that's why here you have communes that are able to turn into city-states, whereas a commune out there was mostly just under a bishop or a count, and not doing much more by maybe sending some levy every once in a while. During those wars. The wars, however, proportionally exhausting for them as well. This is just for making you understand by scale what we're discussing. Many people say that like the Seigneury affirmation is a proof of the general instability and weakness of the communal system. If you have followed what I said so far, you realize it's rather an evolution. Right, that there is no such thing like an opposition between the Seigneury and the commune. The commune wants the Seigneury. The commune establishes the Seigneury in a moment of actual growth of the same communal power. And in fact, here chronologically we must distinguish that, because the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century is not the mid-14th. Right? And if there is a general crisis that is ignited by the same struggles, it is not because there is a power that cannot prevail from a commune, right? This is even for Florence, for Milan. These were major cities that had managed to grow so much to actually conquer others. So it's rather the political and military divide that you have to focus on at that point, and not pretending this was a system that was inherently destined to fail when yes, the general crisis affected also those communes, like basically the entire Eurasia proportionally. But these things again managed to stand on their feet and began to even extend their power in that moment at a regional level, because the other cities could not hold, like they were exhausted. And what is interesting by studying the period is to see how, of course, there were major destructions waged. I made multiple videos in the top fixed comment. I list you like all the videos about the crisis of the Italian communes, the affirmation of the mercenary companies, the victory actually of in part of even of the rural aristocracy that was still communal in practice, but that sort of managed to erode communal power from the exile, from the countryside, letting in the major communes into like these cities by getting the power from them as some sort of co-opted aristocracy loyal to that foreign regime, and it's really a struggle that was never over. For example, the commune never manages to fully control the entirety of their district. And these districts were incredibly wealthy, but given the fair, Italy is, it's not that it's not a large country, but most of the population is concentrated just in some areas, right? And so this is well represented by the communal development, because as we were saying before, you have these 30 city-states fundamentally concentrated all in central northern Italy. Great parts of this are mountainous as well, so these districts are not larger than some hundreds of square kilometers, which means that if you want to raid into a neighboring district, you can't just do that in a couple of days. Entirely, you can ravage the enemy crops. This had always been about communal warfare, except at this point, these powers that did that habitually and seasonally and without preventing the growth during the 12th to 13th century. During the 14th century, collapse. Right? They are still rich, they're still powerful, but the political glue that kept them together internally melted. And it melted because when you read the chronicles that are the bread of the medievalists in this sense, and this political balance, you realize that the people said stop. Right? In other words, the greatest lesson that you get from this is that all those people that were saying we don't want to pay taxes, we don't want war, we actually have wealth, but we don't want to invest it, to spend it, went down. Were conquered by other peoples, right? Which is disturbingly enough what you hear today. I mean, you hear it in any time in history. Lesser people have always been against war, have always been pacifistic, which means actually actively supporting the enemies of their own community in a militaristic sense, by acting like we shouldn't make wars of surrendering to an aggressor, because they just prefer to be under somebody else than keep it even in a degraded fashion, because fundamentally they are against authority, they are against they're the fourth estate. They don't tolerate that there is somebody who achieves more than them in any way, and so to them, after all, being conquered by somebody else is okay. And even though this region would maintain the highest per capita wealth in the world until the late 17th century, of course, the crisis came when the neighboring seigneuries managed to conquer their own. And you definitely see the autocratization, the populisticization of politics at the same time, the privatization, the oligarchization. There is definitely a collapse. There is a level in the social fabric that definitely gives way, right? And this happens mostly, in fact, at a lower level. During the 14th century, during the late Middle Ages, contrary, in fact, to the modernistic, progressistic myth, this is exactly the moment in which the people go down, in which liberties go down. There was not such a thing like an improvement of the, say, in absolute terms, yes, generally speaking, the world improved in lifestyle, not too much over the Ancien regime, but meaning in relative terms, politically speaking, people lost freedom during the Renaissance, right? They had, in relative terms, more freedom before. I still meet with an incredibly large amount of actually adult people that believe the opposite. I don't know what kind of history they have studied, in which, not on which books, in which institutions, but it's, macroscopically notorious that this is the thing. I mean, when you study the early modern age, the late Middle Age, that's like the first thing you learn under any, every study basically points that out. There is not a counter to that, but still, again, we have been fed with this idea that in the Renaissance, the individual achieved more freedom in the actual sense that there were, freer people politically in the 1500s than there had been in the 1200s, which is utterly insane in an historical sense. But again, there are entire countries that built the idea that we got out of this terrible Middle Ages where nothing worked, and so the early modern age is the most beautiful thing that ever happened. It's really not true, and very often these countries were far still from emancipating themselves as they would do actually later, damaging, of course, the imperial tradition, and at that point profiting and being sometimes also with the single most developed countries in the world today, but having in fact the greatest problems with the lack of traditional values, mass immigration, cultural dilution, incredible ignorance, in spite of the fact that, again, wealth, good education, I can put myself, my homeland in the same way. It's a greater problem. It invests the entire world. It's not like we are all Westerners, we are all in. I am in the Western world narrowly meant, and that's the thing you confront with yourself every day, because it's really about your own identity, it's really about your own history. Many people come on my channel because I think that I'm the most sort of obscurantistically autocratic supporting and, anti modernity thing. That's not actually the thing. Like, there is a good side of modernity that is actually still tradition, in an accomplishment of tradition, because again, nothing that works even in the last 100 of the years could work if it wasn't traditional. And then there is of course the fourth estate, or populistic, liberalistic, leftistic, communistic, socialistic, collectivistic thing that is just an abortion of subhuman indignity, and that we have to cope with every day, because we still have the lesser people thinking that it's better to self-sabotage than telling actually how history went, or working with what we have accomplished, also what our own ancestors collectively did, with incredible wealth and power that we still own. But unfortunately, again, that's the world that you see. Studying this chapter of history is exactly looking at the same thing in many ways. At least the Italians lost a part of their independence in the 16th century. But it's obvious that also the regional states that were affirmed during this point were not able at some point to confederate in some national form, and they suffered, in fact, later on, the full might of greater monarchic powers, stattal powers, importantly enough, like the Spanish, the French, partly again the Germans, even though again remaining very decentralized, very autonomous, very very rich still. So that's why the Renaissance is complicated, because you have these two phases, right? Great development, but at the same time also softening up, and it does pass through this crisis as well. Of course, the 14th century was a moment of major crisis for many, right? There were other countries that had to suffer this. For example, Germany would not really unify until pretty late in time. And in fact, Italy and Germany were considered so-called weak areas of Europe still until the 18th century, because of they were so fragmented. They had not, especially Germany, created even probably a state within. At least the Italian regional states had formed this sort of modern state. A great part of the modern state was founded in places, in fact, like Florence, like Milan, like Venice. Central Europe was still more feudal, more private, more like devoid of stattal culture that to some degree had never existed even historically in those places yet. So it takes really a lot of, the Germans had the Sonderweg, right, that somehow is admirable, because what they managed to accomplish when they were finally unified was in fact utterly insane as well in world history. But you can never, like, you have to cope with your past as well, and realize in every country, national history, what is that, like, went right, but also what went wrong. Because if you're able to counterbalance the two sides, like, you can't find out what is the face of the other, and you can't sort of take the next step forward, that's a civilizational accomplishment. Otherwise, you just remain there like a potato, not really accomplishing much, which is like a crisis of purpose that we're somehow undergoing, at least because we are similarly in a phase of post-great enormous boom and development, etc. And we are realizing that we have to take, again, the reins of many other political and strategical aspects, and we got habituated to that because we had our own seigneury, and there is nothing wrong when you accept that. Right, after World War II, yes, Europe was under, at least Western Europe, under the Americans, but it was a great moment of development and a pretty light presence. It was not despotic, subcultural abortion like in Eastern Europe. Like it was incredibly profitable. Now it's the moment to emancipate and still cooperate with the broader Western world, that also because we are so intertwined, and we're basically the same in historical origin, in spite of course the changes that happened for other reasons in the last generations, that it's a pity not to recognize this. And people sometimes do not even have the pedestal of where to begin with this. Like, if you don't study history, you cannot understand these concepts. you will think that you're just like a monad. You will act paranoid. Like it's still, again, the average fourth estater position. Not understanding anything, being scared as a consequence, and behaving hysterically and irrationally, and not, in fact, going under the next lord, because that's what history teaches us at the end of the day. But as I was just saying, when you go to looking at the how it happened in Italy, at least at this point, let's say the loss in power was not, let's say, it invested many aspects of social, also of political life, but it was also the consolidation of oligarchies that had de facto already ruled over the commune. As we were saying before, also the so-called popolo was not like, I don't know, the shoemakers ruling over the city, right? The fact that Italy had city-states is also something different from other rather towns in Europe. For example, the Flemish never had, like, in spite of their communal development, like a statal regime. Like they were just basically a bunch of guilds that never managed to confederate in a unitary government, and that all, in fact, had been coexisting with a much stronger feudal authority, and would go under the same feudal authority that at some point they had even tried to emancipate themselves from. And this is particularly evident. Is that, I guess we were saying before, the Italians literally are, out on their own with regional states, with a real state, a real army, a real political center, right? That is run often, again, by the same oligarchies that have run the system, right? It's a bit complicated here to resume what, like, the communal establishment had been historically. Surely we will make some videos more specifically about Florence. For example, I want for the original series the next Italian chapter to be about Florence. That is the best documented reality, the one that also, because of the more republican physiognomy, is easier to, let's say, dissect in all these various groups that confederated. We talked about it relatively, at least in terms of power shareholding, let's say, in the video about the guilds, of the Italian guilds recently. The important being that these oligarchies had always been clientelally ruling the system on their own, and they were specifically in Italy at the center, as we've seen also in the videos about banking and commerce, literally at the head of the European finance. They controlled basically the European and Mediterranean trade routes, and so they were quite peculiar in their own regard, but not peculiar in the sense that they were just the exception that confirms the rule. They were really, again, a massive chunk of continental power reflecting itself in these statal entities. The concept behind these power is, let's say, the need of an arbiter, as we were saying before, for the podestal, like having justice, having a fixed point of reference, certainty of penalties, for example. Like the first prisons are born at this point. Like usually in the Middle Ages, there were some punishment, corporal ones, property confiscations, death, etc. People did not go to jail, literally. Like in countries like in cities like Florence, for example, start having actual prisons to maintain for a long time prisoners of different entity, mostly actually war prisoners, right? But because these were sort of the important political ones that run the other cities, in more permanent structures, meant properly to remain in this great public palaces that held hosted the general councils, that really embodied a new force, a new iron fist that was necessary to bring order, discipline, and reason. If you look at philosophy, I made a video about rhetoric and the development at this point, together with the juridical ones, etc. Like, again, the Italians were really much on the forefront, everything concerned, and therefore really providing a more orderly and unitary functioning of this system. Right? This is a step that no other city takes in Europe. Right? There is not such thing. If you study, we will study the history, I don't know, of the Scandinavian towns. We saw something about the French communes, for example, also about the German ones. None of these take the next step of really being a state that is able to affirm itself internationally and dictating its own law and having it affirmed, not depending on some greater power of strongman. Right? This is relevant because the Italian Seigneury are, at the end of the day, local citizens, right, from the most prominent families of the Patriciate, and some of them are actual noblemen from the ancient feudal lineages. Others are just, again, oligarchs that have become quite rich with trade, etc. They also compenetrate each other, really, because these Patriciate tends to imitate with international royalty. Think about the marriages of the Visconti or the Medici with the French royal house, that in turn was obsessed with everything Italian from the Renaissance and culture, art, etc. They tended to imitate their own fashion, and vice versa, because again, these were ancien regime elites that were running Europe and fundamentally being at the same level, even though they were of different instruction and different concepts, but they tended to bond at that point. Of course, we are very far from the 13th, the 14th. Well, okay, it did happen with the Visconti, especially in the 14th century, because that was the most sort of hierarchical state, in fact, in Italy. I mean, the Milanese one, as we've seen the other day. But in general, in fact, also in the... we talk Florence regarding the Republican order, but this is a bit the same with Milan. Like, Milan conquered these other Lombard cities, and the Milanese bankers cashed like the local merchants' assets. This made the Milanese quite richer. The local cities were run, they accepted this, they decided to give up mostly the enormous military effort that remaining independent had entailed, and beginning just to pay the Milanese for hiring mercenaries. And so even avoiding if you wonder how the condottieri eventually affirmed themselves historically, like, that's how it had. The Italians were so rich, and especially they were invested for this reason in so many crafts and industries, that going at war professionally, permanently, was not really a thing, right? First of all, the lords themselves did not want that, because they did want, as we will see now, to maintain the order, and arming the masses is dangerous for that matter. There is, in fact, an effort, even in this regard, to, say, detach from the most immediately economical or corporative social contrapositions, meaning what had been the communal struggle before within the city, connected with this family. Yeah, it was rather now like let's be under a single rule. Let's understand that our interest is the one of the entire city at this point, if we have the means to rule over others. And this is exactly what the other cities had failed in doing. They had just complained about the harshness of this, of wars, of taxes. Sometimes they were really vexated, where their countryside was destroyed. They suffered heavily, but they were also very resourceful, and many of their resources, exactly because they were so rich, they were not spent because they had already habituated themselves to a kind of better life than risking their own in battle. In fact, there were many substitutions for the military service. That's again what fueled the condottieri system as well, not just through the hiring of foreign mercenaries, but also just saying to poor people, like, okay, well, I owe the state, the commune, a military service on horseback because I'm so rich, like a merchant or whatever. I will send a guy from my clientele to war in my stead, right? There is say an aim of impartiality. The idea is that the state has to be really just. There is a great debate around this. There is a similar dynamic in the feudal monarchies of the time. We've seen how even from strong struggles in countries like Castile or France, after all, the idea of the necessity of a cohesion at an oligarchic level to ensure the future of the polity is affirmed, and so the monarchy, the state, is strengthened further, paradoxically, even through clashes that could undermine it at some point. And in fact, the lordships develop in Italy as well a repressive capacity in an increasingly effective way in relation to the gradual demilitarization of the main political groups that, as we've seen, were mostly oligarchic in nature themselves. I mean, Italian communes had been run mostly in these councils, in the communal institution, by different clans, houses that had their own military, had their own house towers, their own clienteles, their own retinues, their own lands, etc. So great part of the struggle had revolved already from before the affirmation of the lords around, like, what kind of groups are really fighting in this sense. That there had been lots of exiles that would be fostered by the rival communes. The divisions between Guelphs and Ghibellines followed roughly these patterns. We will have to get much more in depth about the actual alignments. It's very complicated for Italy because, as you understand, all the city-states had, again, several of these clans, so you should remember hundreds of groups that also need adequate contextualization. It's very difficult to tell this history. Again, you can't blame, to some extent, the, say, historiography and culture not having been able to fully represent these guys, right? But it's just like saying everybody knows the Montecchi and the Capuletti from Romeo and Juliet, but except these were actually some of these clans in Verona, and they were important, and they were part of that context, but just you get the Shakespeare thing better because it say became more legitimately relevant in European and Western culture. But there's still a lot underneath that is not just a story. It's sort of also the political context, right, that you may want to take into consideration. So I talked about this extensively in the series about Dante for the 700th anniversary of his death in 2021, and there I explained, of course, the poet, the artist, the literate, but primarily I explained the politician, the knight, the like also the landholder, like that Dante was in quite active and important sense. I mean, if everybody knows who Dante is in a literary sense, but if even just the most basic information that he was a priore of Florence, so literally running the city at some point, and fighting in the elite vanguard of the Florentine army at the Battle of Campaldino. Like this is like, and having a sort of a military history later on and before this already, like it's not something that most people are familiar with, and I think this is really a pity because it's actually much more interesting eventually to read the author after knowing what kind of man he actually was, right? Even to let's say an unexpected degree, because now Dante wrote what he did, and so we know who he was, but there were lots of people just like him that even had those literary capacities and ambitions, and that are just the same names that you randomly mention in what would appear to an average person in the West today, like the strange families of the Italian communes that you say, what the hell are they? Well, they produce people of the caliber of Dante, and this is not even just to stick to the lords, like Cangrande or Matteo Visconti or Castruccio, etc. So this is the world we're discussing. Castruccio was a favorite of Edward I of England, right? And that's something you may want to appreciate, considering that he apparently fought also in the war between France and Flanders. He was, again, one of the most important military commanders of his time. In Italy, he was allied and friend with Ludwig of Wittelsbach. Like, you have an immense background. Just think about making a TV series of the one people get fixated with. Like, the entire Middle Ages was like this, and people seem to lack it completely. Also because if you look at things like Game of Thrones, etc., they're just for, evidently, in a narrative sense, for chicken-brained people. Like, when you study history, you realize history is much more cool, complex, intelligent, and incredible, really, than these really cheap subcultural expressions of a deranged and alienated society, I think, that, like the one that we have produced. So naturally, it took time before the lordships really developed to the extent we can consider even dynastic. There were many later families that started from here. Like, if you look at the Este, were quite old, for example. They were a branch of the Welfen. Actually, the Welfen stemmed from the Este. They were very ancient Carolingian family. From those very old times. There were the Gonzaga that were installed in Mantua by Cangrande. There were the same De La Scala were actually stemming from the textile industry, like corporatist oligarchs. You have the Montefeltro that eventually would become some of the most important lords in the Italian Renaissance as papal subjects. These were normally families of warbanders that essentially just trained from the Apennines, like this rough, primitive, but also very military skilled lineages, selling their own services. In fact, also as podestas, think about Buonconte of Montefeltro carrying out the very important military reform of Pisa that would become, in fact, in the first half of the 14th century, the single most tactically performing of the Italian communes, in this best tempered relation between the Seigneury and the communal government. This is striking to understand. The best, most successful military powers in Italy are the ones that are more balanced between the communal power that keeps on existing and the lord that was cooperating with them at the same time for these different functions, right? So much has to do with the pre-existing social background of the city. For example, Pisa was much more republican and sort of, as you know, mercantile. Let's say, yes, it was a maritime republic, but differently from the other ones in Italy, it had a massive hinterland. At least before Venice created its own terra firma as well, but that was also kind of a different thing. And it was thus a stronger, like the citizens were stronger overall. But they had also a lord and a hell of a military power and a hell of a concentrated power. And this shows you how, in fact, the city was quite powerful and not going down like others that were taken over by neighboring lords, like Lucca, for example, just to remain with other Tuscan cities. The Cerullo company of German mercenaries just rolling the city at the dikes, right, and selling it to the highest bidder, right, in Tuscany. Eventually, it went to the De La Scala and later on Florence. But just for saying, like, there are some cities that make it for a reason, others that don't. Again, this video is not really aimed at making a list of that, but that's also why I make the original series for every single Italian commune, because they are all, as we were saying before, very homogeneous in many ways, but they also have a different history, of course. The disarmament of the population is also relevant, because just like today, you see, we live in a fundamentally disarmed society, right? Even in America, where of course there are constitutional rights that are stressed, also rightfully in fact the duty and the privilege, not just the right, because that's the actually traditional meaning of rights, of bearing arms. So importantly, of course, the population does not have a real capacity to stop like a military like their own, or of course in that sense an invading one if there wasn't one locally. It's just, of course, much more about the United States and its internal cohesion, in spite of all the problems that exist, that allows that balance not to be broken, right? So in this Italian context, for example, it's, as we've seen, the citizens that want to disarm themselves, that don't want to go to war anymore. They do not want to risk their lives to go on expeditions against the rebels of the, say, of the Apennines, depending on where they are. And it is exactly, in fact, the most popularly based systems that tendentially are worn out the earliest, unless they are very strongly supported by major interests, just as we've seen in Pisa, for example. There is some, do not underestimate in that sense popular power. Bologna has a very interesting history in that regard. They do get a lord at the end of the day, but it's just a much more gradually tempered affirmation of the lordship, because the people are somehow strong. These were the guys who at Fossalta literally went just infantry alone against the, eventually cavalry arrived because they always operated in both, but captured Heinz, the king of Sardinia, like the son of Frederick II, and like had this spirit of, you know, popular power. The Emilians normally were about this because they were large agricultural centers without much industry, and so there was a greater participation to sort of the levy historically. But also this began to wear out when you start having not citizen soldiers, but literal professional in arms that make that for a living, and as the mercenaries that are affirming themselves at this point. And of course the superiority of heavy cavalry in general, that was also the expression of these oligarchic clans in the same Italian communes, was just dominant overall. We've seen it well in Lombardy, especially. It was just historically a subordination of the people to the oligarchy. And I also use these terms in ways I should. I mean, the people had its own oligarchies as well. The Florentine guilds were hyper rich, hyper powerful. They were a thing. But let's say the idea of a chivalric, when not knightly nobility, right, for example, was much more affirmed in Lombardy, which is also what favored the much more hierarchical Milanese Seigneury compared to, say, like we just said, Bologna or Florence, right? So these are differences that one must understand, because we know very well what they were. The important is to put them in the adequate perspective and stressing the interaction within the same on such basis. The disarmament of the political groups was legitimized by the fact that objectively the communes often underwent this sort of coups. One family wanted to prevail over the other. The groups that would support one faction or the other could be incredibly complex. Society was incredibly developed in these centers, so you could have very different levels of stratification, of factionalism, or corporations, or again alignments with other cities, with foreign rulers, etc. So there's no single form. But this, as we've seen, produced one of actually the highest level of bellicosity in Europe, and the necessity to stop this, like saying we need a stable government, we cannot go on with this continuous violence in the city, because also the people, for example, in the narrow districts was very difficult to dislodge. Like there were really bloody engagement. That's the only place where cavalry had really struggled, right? The need to at least discipline the citizens, trying to, for example, prohibit the use of catapults privately, which had been a thing actually. You would have in your clanic house quarter massive arsenals of catapults, of crossbows, of ammo, weapons of every kind. Well, the commune wants to have a monopoly in that, for example, just even for infrastructural reasons. For example, the largest trebuchet pieces, beams, were maintained in the normally in the public palace of the commune, also with lots of catapults, so that when massive gatherings of angry people throwing stones and more against the police happened, catapults could arrive and starting creating massive as horrendous gaps into the thick crowd with these weapons. So this was important just to stabilize, especially the mercantile activities that were so powerful. And so you have these power groups increasing through banking and through their position, their power, and becoming, in fact, the ones represented in the councils, representing the establishment, the oligarchy, the aristocracy, right? So they were objectively the better people, and they kind of were also the ones who gave work to the others, etc. So it's along these lines that the government stabilizes, right? You need the monopoly of physical coercion in function of the actuation of the orders of the law, right? So this is pretended by the lord and by the governmental oligarchy that was always the expression of at the end of the day, because there was not such a thing like a single lord or a single family running area. I mean, yes, in some contexts, especially in the most mature Renaissance, you have something like that, but at the beginning it was about an establishment producing this, right, and representing the decisive majority of the people. By the way, we use the term signorie but in a historiographical sense, but the titles these guys would assume were very different. Like the corresponding Latin official one was dominus, which literally means lord. But there were many other offices, as we've seen. The podestas often were de facto lords, or there were other titles that could be given also for different lengths of time, perpetually, maybe captain of the people, or summing up even multiple ones, right? It wasn't the idea that there was, first of all, the idea that the commune ruled itself according to some internal agreement, a consensus between the parts, and so not really just one guy that autocratically and tyrannically ruled over everybody that wasn't the thing. And still, when the lords became autocrats and dynasts, they still relied on an impressive subtle machine by that point that justified their presence as single rulers and just the people that saw the entire city, the entire state as an asset that they had to defend and that they would defend. This is not different from feudalism in a sense, in the way the same national monarchies had been developing, except, of course, the communes would always maintain this sort of more republican physiognomy, so that when you compare them to other powers, yes, you do tend to say these were republics or mercantile republics. It's an approximation, considering what existed at the time. It is not necessarily how they saw themselves, right? For example, the mercantile adjective is sort of misused most of the time. These guys did not see themselves as a mercantile republic. They saw themselves as, first of all, a commune, and a political and military power that was also, yes, pretty rich and involved in finance and in trade, but like any other power for that matter. So again, it took time to pacify the system. We have seen it often in the Italian communes, regional series. It's mostly throughout the 14th century, it's crisis that gradually the city, personal, or oligarchic seigneury, with its gradual territorial implications and its authoritarian character, would consolidate the institutions and, for the needs of overall control, crystallize the social relations. Right? As I was saying before, when we think about humanism and the Renaissance, we're looking at these great scholars and scientists, etc., because there are courts now that can foster them, right? Otherwise, everything was sort of much more spontaneous before, and so these great figures are not just the expression of some random guy going around the city and for other reasons just becoming that. Like, they were really financed. There was a great competition between the lords for doing so. This was the product, again, of this planetary, patronizing transformation that, again, the crisis of the late Middle Ages had unavoidably produced. The people went down, generally speaking. They are really the citizens as such are separated from the way politics ran. I mean, this, of course, this development had also a grim, cold, ruthless, violent dimension. Fewer people had decisional capacity, and most you can see it even from historiography. Who before was, say, at the time of Dante, like a Villani, for example, was I don't know, just a magistrate, a merchant, a historian, whatever, that was involved in all the political affairs of the government, whatever. Now was just a guy who was literally, watching from the window, like what was happening, and or writing in a studium for the Lord that was maintaining him there, researching philologically. That's why when you have a bit also classicism and sort of you see why all, for example, ancient history was starting to be recovered at that point, because you could study their politics harder than studying your own at the moment, and making comparisons with the reality, but not interfering, being particularly dangerous for the government that was taking care of matters, also in an efficient way for those time standards, as we've seen with development of the regional states. The same Condotta's armies were really a thing by science, but so these are all things that we have to see more in depth, but you realize the scale of as successful models after all. There is, of course, a loss in vigor of the political impulses of groups, of estates, of particular factions that had tried just always to keep power. These are more alive in the in the more peripheral areas. Many of these regional states govern from a central city, and in the outskirts you have all these other cities that have been subjected. And naturally, the more distant, the more difficult the direct control is. And so you would have usually a local aristocrat who came from the ancient factions of the city that would rule. And there would be other families that wanted to overthrow him, and very often these were sponsored by some of your rivals, and so yes, there could be coups, changes, assassination. That's where mostly all the plot culture of Renaissance Italy sort of was idealized from, but it really corresponded to a very sort of functional way of handling matters in that context. Right? There is, as we were saying, a drastic restriction of the area of participation to government in the city. This was the consequence, as cause of the depression of those of the less powerful groups. In other words, again, the commoners lost power, just like everywhere at this point. Think about the Jacquerie, think about all the failed movements from the the English Revolt, what Tyler, John Bolt, the Hussites, again, there are these sparks in Italy and in Flanders. You have the revolts of the salaried workers. They're all put down. Like late Middle Ages brings to the sinking of all the lowest class. None of them succeed to any extent. There is a massive oligarchization of power. These guys played and lost badly, and that surely must be justified in where and are. I mean, again, it's the sick, modernistic, and progressistic vision says, "Oh my God, what a terrible thing! It's all the fault of those powerful people at the top." What about, those at the bottom actually had the means of succeeding and they failed because they were incapable, because they were also rigged in some way, right? That's never an idea that comes into somebody's mind. They were limited, they were weak, they were not weak in potential to what they could do, right? So there's not if the world worked like you think it did, at this point we would have just already collapsed like a civilization, because everybody would have this constantly repressed the weak, and you wouldn't even find a reason for which the weak, after having always repressed, should have eventually reacquired power, unless you actually show that the system went on positively, and for eventually the elites to provide power for fostering this lower estates, as it happened with the bourgeoisie in the 18th century. So that's completely skipped, because it doesn't fit the narrative that every person is responsible for every single thing that happens to them all the time, even if it's somebody doing it to them. It's the same thing, right? The person doing it and the person suffering in it are the same thing, the same action. You cannot distinguish. It's the people who does that to them to have the responsibility as much as the person suffering it. And this is a double, because you see, if you consider just one, it's moral relativism. You can fabricate all the justifications for you being a slob and not having responsibility and saying, "Oh, everything happens to me," and doing nothing about that. Where's the limit? Where do you draw the line? Right? So this is not an explanation. Doesn't hold morally or scientifically, especially when confronting history, right? This is, I think, just if one doesn't get this, it's useless for them to study history in the first place, or at least they should do it more. Without mentioning that actually in this context, the social and political dialectic was not erased, right? With the Jacquerie, the ferocious repression carried out on the peasantry by the French aristocracy, you have literally the peasants missing the realistic opportunity of being represented as the fourth estate in the French Parliament. In Italy, that essentially that just from the Renaissance, the plurality of opinions, of ideas, still was maintained. The same Italian system was composed by tens of smaller states. Doesn't matter how depending on one another. They produced different literates. They had different international connections. So this is true in general, just for the in a political sense, not just for the society. I mean, not even in France, that was a very autocratic, a very authoritarian system. In many ways, there was a wide room for autonomy in political thinking, in juridical theorization, etc. It's just, of course, the expression of those who can afford to participate in this dialectic, but it's also a pretty wide one. I mean, there is we're talking the late Middle Ages. The coercive power of these states was quite limited compared to much more recent statal capacities, right? It's really like today. We live in very strong states, but we have a great voice plurality, right? Unlike many people would like to present the story. As I was saying before, at this point, according to them, you should always all be in jail, killed, or whatever. Like, we can all express our opinion. We can make our voice heard, and even without control. In this sense, without too much in that regard. And this is something that in other states is not possible. And the states also increased dramatically their repressive measures, unlike anything you see in the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages is, again, the age of obscurantism, and the bad one that we freed ourselves from. And it wasn't what you think. It's a different era, but it's not like the hallmark of repression or, let's say, lack of rights or representation, whatever. Like, there are much darker contemporary realities that are to witness what we're talking about here, that a strong state doesn't mean a weaker people, actually quite the contrary. And it's only inferior cultures that allow themselves to be ruled by more authoritarian regimes, because they cannot afford to have power on their own, and they sort of lazily, cowardly confer power to incompetent people that are just the reflection of a lesser culture, like the one of the people is, as always in those cases, and nothing more, right? And that's a historical problem, and you must investigate. It's not just like what a country decides to do from a day to another. It has radically deep historical roots that date back millennia, right? And in order to understand Western superiority, you must understand, in fact, also what Western Europe was at this point in history and what it went through, right? This is quite instructive, because while, in fact, in Western Europe, the states were, as we were saying before, founding themselves in a way that they would have continuously evolved, statally-wise, still today, many states in Central and Eastern Europe failed at this point. The elective monarchies essentially failed, right? They would take other more sort of authoritarian powers to recompact them, and with a significant deficit in civic and public culture throughout the centuries that you can still see today. There is a radical divide in this sense that I don't know how can still be denied. In just in the historical interest, what would you like the most, right? Do you like savages? Like, I'm making it, of course, in the extreme sense. Or do you like civilized people? Because that's a question that at some point you must ask yourself in your life, politically, historically, ideologically. What side do you belong to, right? What do you think that again, if you think of yourself like surrounded by enemies, constantly threatened, like in a powerless way, as if you were just a poor martyr / victim of the circumstance, chances are that you belong to the savage, to the underdeveloped, right? If you maybe see the same threat, but you realize that you have the strength to fight it in a functional way, well, chances are that you are, in a successful way, you are from the civilized side. This is not to say that more advanced countries do not have the same problems, right? In keeping the balance, actually, they arguably have more of that. But there's also a huge advantage that, especially if you are raised in the West, you tend to not see, because you're habituated to it. You do not know what it means to live at least you learn by speaking with them, like in a country like, I don't know, a post-socialist state. People idealize these because they are told that these are allegedly more, I don't know, conservative realities. They are not. Like, much more atheistic. They have much greater level of abortion, of illnesses, of poverty. Like, they're nowhere of a place where there is any functional government or whatever compared to yours. But again, if you're too uneducated, or just you're alienated from reality to understand that, chances are that you're at the bottom of society, and so you really belong to the fourth estate, and to the lowest kind that exists also in more developed countries. So be always very careful about who you are and what you think and what you do, and especially what kind of effort you make in your life, because not all efforts are the same by quantity and quality, and you have to be quite careful about where you are directed, because it's easy to shipwreck by all these, let's say, by a lack of say of points of reference, right? So as we've seen again in the other contexts of the late Middle Ages, you can say the political struggle was channeled and delimited to the elites, right? They were again feeding, maintaining, fostering, helping the other estates that supported it. You see a level of parliamentarism developing in the process. You have, of course, a pretty stratified society and lots of inequality, but at the same time, it's a system that holds, that has the power to compete with ours and to keep developing on its own. And these are, again, some of the places where actually life quality, power concentration is actually the highest in the world. There are, in fact, also mechanisms of promotion, of cooptation of the best elements of society, right? There is the possibility of accessing a urban oligarchy. This happens in different ways. Even military service could be a way to be rewarded in that regard. For example, from the 70s, the 80s of the 14th century, all the condottieri become Italian. Actually, this is the actual moment, the period of the condottieri. And in that case, if you were a successful soldier, and maybe you were even of very low extraction to some degree, think about this Sforza historical, right, the peasantry, you could become even one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Of course, that's an exception. But again, it was not such a rigid system like you find in other places in Europe, like especially in the East or in Central Europe. For this reason, you have, after all, a coherent physiognomy that sort of favored even a general collective discipline of society, right, and political organization. Like this was a gradual, archaic way compared to our way of development, but still one that brought to our days in a way of another, right? There is, for this reason, also an element of meritocracy that stems from the reward of an aristocracy for in the real meaning of the term, right? The aristocratic vocation of the Seigneury in Italy is really rewarding some of the most dynamic, active, enterprising elements of society. Many Seigneury, many lords of later times emerged from actually successful people that, as we've seen, were not the historical, feudal nobility dynasts of, the, Carolingian times, etc. But they still managed to achieve comparable power because they had managed to work out their own, to affirm themselves as military commanders, being enfeoffed by the local regional states, creating their own seigneury, contributing again to this greater coordination and of powers in the peninsula, and together still within the empire as imperial subjects, by the way, being recognized by the emperors as rulers. And so it's all very after all, coherent system that allows much more autonomy socially and politically than we can see even after the full affirmation of the seigneuries, right? So one key aspect here is remembering that the Seigneury is wanted in power. There is no such thing like a government anywhere in the world and in history that is not supported by the decisive majority of the people, and that cannot rule without that. There is no doubt that the 14th century was a moment of crisis, of general a regression of civilization. If you want, in part, this oligarchization, this privatization did correspond to this. It was surely also an active consequence. So this is not to say that, again, the system went down just for some external reason, like the Black Death. As we were saying before, we think ever more that these behaviors were, especially continuous infighting, were responsible for that collapse pretty much everywhere. But the responsiveness, the way that the system settled and it sort of managed to found itself further, to spring back again in the following centuries, is something that rested on these elites that managed to keep things together, right? And in some cases, like you have in Florence, for example, in the 40s of the, still as late as that, for example, some popular revivals that were, however, not the people in a, I mean, the people, even the commoners could be co-opted in their revolts. There are episodes of this kind, but on the longer run, right, they did not hold, right? They, as we were saying before, there were some revolts, like think about the Chompe one, the salaried workers, etc. They could violently achieve something. But aside from the fact that in the larger centers, you would have largely still an oligarchic hand behind these movements, or at least one that could repress them and mitigate them without much of a problem. In fact, these were some sort of regurgitation of some lower estates that were much richer, in fact, than what, as we've seen, were the average in the rest of the continent. Again, the highest per capita wealth, and so this would affect the capacity of, as citizens, to participate more directly in politics, but not necessarily. Again, in France, you have the Jacquerie, extensively agricultural and feudal reality, right? Rural and feudal reality. The movements in the Italian communes are different because the city in itself is already something like the product of the surplus of the countryside, and it's in it that, of course, there are going to be more political agitations, more individual liberty, right? Otherwise, there would have not even been cities of that political capacity as a whole, right? So I think these perspectives must be very much framed accurately in the right historical perspective, in the right historical dimension. It's difficult. Again, I touched today on many different topics. We will surely see this better when observing singular historical realities in, like, for example, the single communes and their history. But, right, they are not, in fact, to be simply just like observed individually. This was a systemic dimension, and you need always the essence and the detail at the same time. So again, I will spend myself better in more in-depth videos. I'm struggling actually to provide something more in-depth. I know I have actually a lot of material to draw from, but I've always thought that getting the basis right first and then driving to the most let's say in the most detailed aspects is more relevant is more effective and more important, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.